My name is Silas. I am a back-end architect for a high-volume fintech firm called Stratos Integration. Before the arrival, as we now call it, Stratos was a cathedral of logic. We dealt in micro-latencies, encrypted data packets, and server uptimes that were measured in the 99th percentile. Our office was a sea of ergonomic chairs, dual-monitor setups, and a silence so profound you could hear the blood rushing through your own ears. We were a team of 30, roughly 20 men and 10 women. And for 5 years, gender was about as relevant to our daily operations as the color of the socks we wore. We were code monkeys and data wizards. If your script worked, you were a god. If it broke, you were immortal. That was the only hierarchy that mattered. Then, our founders sold the firm to a massive conglomerate, and the human optimization phase began. They told us we needed a culture that matched our revenue. They told us we were unrefined. And then they sent us Sloan. Sloan didn't walk into a room. She colonized it. She was 34, wore architectural glasses that cost more than my first car, and spoke in a dialect of corporate sociolinguistics that felt like being hit in the face with thesaurus. She wasn't a developer. She wasn't a marketer. Her title was Principal Culture Architect and Equity Strategist. On her first day, she didn't ask to see our codebase or our client list. She asked for the office seating chart and a list of all informal social clusters. Within 72 hours, the gray sanctuary was dead. The posters of NASA nebulae and classic circuit boards were replaced with identity alignment banners. The break room, once a place of spirited debates about C++ versus Rust, was plastered with infographics about linguistic weight and the architecture of the unspoken. But the real change, the thing that would eventually lead to the total collapse of Sloan's world, happened on her first Friday. She called a mandatory systemic recalibration meeting. "We are here to debug the human element," Sloan announced, standing at the head of the glass wall conference room. She didn't use a chair. She stood with a posture so rigid it looked painful, her eyes scanning the room like a laser level looking for a tilt. Stratos Integration has been operating as a monocultural vacuum. You see code. I see a reinforced structure of male-centered dominance. You see silence. I see the suppression of the marginalized voice. I looked at Sarah. Our lead front-end dev, Sarah, had been with us since the beginning. She was the one who usually led the debates. She looked at me, her eyebrows disappearing into her hairline. She looked as confused as I was. Sloan tapped a button on her tablet, and a slide deck appeared on the massive 4K screen. It was titled, The Omni-Equity Protocol, Rules for a New Vantage, to correct the historical imbalance of this space. Sloan said, her voice dropping into a register practice authority. We are implementing the following protocols. These are not suggestions. They're the new operating parameters of Stratos. She flipped to the first slide. Protocol 1, the linguistic quota. In any meeting, men were forbidden from speaking until at least 2 women had contributed substantive conceptual input. Furthermore, men were required to limit their speaking time to 50% of the total meeting duration, to be tracked by a digital equity timer she had installed on the conference room tablets. Protocol 2, the non-interruption buffer. If a woman was speaking, no man could speak within 5 seconds of her finishing a sentence. This was to prevent the aggressive crowding of female thought space. Protocol 3, the technical deference mandate. Any technical disagreement initiated by a man against a woman's proposal had to be prefaced with a validation acknowledgement. A man could not simply say, "That won't scale." He had to say, "I value the perspective you brought to this architecture, and I want to hold space for its potential. However, for my limited vantage, I have a concern regarding scalability." The room was so quiet, you could hear the cooling fans in the server rack 3 rooms away. Gary, our most senior developer, a man who had written half the original kernel for our software, cleared his throat. He was 62 and had the patience of a mountain. "Sloan, if I may, we're in the middle of the Q3 security patch. If Sarah or Elena suggests a logic gate that I know will leak data, are you saying I have to wait through a 5-second buffer and a validation acknowledgement before I can stop the leak?" Sloan's eyes locked onto Gary. It was a look of pure, predatory satisfaction. This was a patriarchal pushback she had been trained to expect. "Gary," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension usually reserved for toddlers. What you call stopping a leak, I call intellectual gatekeeping. Your urgent need to correct Sarah is a manifestation of your unconscious belief that her logic is inherently flawed until verified by you. Under the omni-equity protocol, we prioritize the safety of the collaborative environment over the speed of the technical output. If the patch takes an extra hour because you had to respect a woman's speaking space, that is a price Stratos is now willing to pay. But it's not an hour, Gary tried to say. You're interrupting, Gary, Sloan snapped, and you haven't waited for a second woman to speak. Sarah, would you like to address Gary's anxiety? Sarah looked at Gary, her mentor and friend of 10 years. She looked at Sloan, who was currently treating the office like a re-education camp. Sarah was a pro. She knew Gary was right. But she also saw the HR rep standing in the back of the room with a tablet, taking notes. I think I'm okay for now, Sarah muttered, her face turning pink. That is an opinion on the protocol, Sarah, Sloan prompted. Tell Gary how it feels to have your space reclaimed. It's fine, Sarah said, refusing to look Gary in the eye. 2 women have spoken, Sloan said, looking back at Gary. The 5-second buffer has passed. You may now respond, Gary, provided you use the proper validation acknowledgement. Gary looked at his hands. He looked at the screen. He looked at the years of work he had poured into this company. Then he did something I didn't expect. He didn't argue. He didn't get angry. He simply closed his laptop. I value the perspective you brought to this architecture, Sloan, Gary said, his voice completely flat. And I want to hold space for its potential. I have no further comments. Sloan beamed. She thought she had broken him. She thought she had successfully reframed a titan of industry. I sat there, watching the data points in my head shift. I realized that Sloan wasn't looking for efficiency. She wasn't even really looking for equality. She was looking for a struggle. She wanted us to fight her so she could prove how fragile we were. She wanted to be the hero of a story where we were the villains. I looked at the other men in the room, Mark, Tom, Javier. I saw the same realization dawning on them. We were logic-driven creatures. We had spent our lives solving systems, and we had just been presented with a new system. It was a stupid system. It was a destructive system, but it was a system with very clear rules. If Sloan wanted a world where men didn't dominate the space, we would give it to her. We would give it to her so completely that she would drown in the silence. The meeting ended with Sloan handing out equity journals to all the men, where we were supposed to log every time we felt the urge to interrupt and how we processed that impulse. I walked back to my desk. I looked at a critical error report that had just come in from our London hub. Normally, I would have alerted the team, called a quick huddle, and had a hot fix pushed by noon. I looked at the report. I looked at Sloan, who was walking through the cubicles, nodding at the identity alignment banners. I didn't call a huddle. I didn't alert Sarah. I didn't even mention it to Gary. I opened a blank document. I started a new crossword puzzle. The security leak was now Sarah's problem to find. The linguistic quota was now my primary job description. I felt a strange, cold peace wash over me. The war hadn't even truly begun, and Sloan had already lost. She just didn't know that the greatest weapon we had wasn't our voices. It was our total, absolute, and indifferent withdrawal. The week following the implementation of the omni-equity protocol was the quietest in the history of Stratos integration. If the office had been a cathedral of logic before, it was now a vacuum. We didn't just follow Sloan's rules. We weaponized them. We turned her sociological constraints into a hard-coded operating system. As developers, we understood that a system is only as good as its edge cases, and we decided to inhabit the edge cases of Sloan's ideology until the entire infrastructure groaned under the weight of its own absurdity. The first thing to die was discretionary effort. In the tech world, that's the phantom energy that keeps a company alive. It's a 3-line fix a dev makes at 2 a.m. because he can't sleep knowing a bug is live. It's the, hey, I noticed a bottleneck in the API comment over a mid-morning coffee. It's the informal high-bandwidth communication that bypasses the slow, clunky hierarchies of management. Sloan had categorized this organic energy as male-centric dominance, so we withdrew it. We became the compliance ghosts. I sat at my desk on Tuesday morning, watching the London Hub error log turn from a cautionary yellow to a screaming neon red. Under the old regime, I would have been halfway to Sarah's desk before the second alert pinged. We would have huddled, whiteboarded the logic flow, and had a fix in the staging environment by lunch. But Rule 2 was the new law of the land. Sarah was in a deep focus session with Elena. To interrupt them would be to colonize their creative thought space. To slack them would be aggressive digital crowding. I looked at the error log. I looked at the equity protocol PDF pinned to my second monitor. Then I looked at the clock. I decided to wait. I opened a technical white paper on a completely unrelated subject and began to read. I wasn't being lazy. I was being equitable. If the system crashed because I wasn't allowed to gatekeep the architecture, then the crash was an equitable outcome. The 11 a.m. sprint planning meeting was where the true horror of Sloan's vision began to manifest. She had installed the digital equity timer on the central conference table, a sleek, glowing orb that pulsed green when a woman spoke and turned a judging, angry red if a man exceeded his allotted time. Sloan sat in the corner, her equity journal open, a pen poised like a scalpel. She wasn't there to plan the sprint. She was there to observe the power dynamics. Sarah, God bless her, tried to start the meeting. Okay, we need to talk about the data migration for the Q4 launch. The current scripts are failing on the legacy database. She stopped. Silence filled the room. Under the protocol, no man could speak until a second woman contributed. Elena was still typing an email, her head down. The men, Gary, Tom, Mark, and myself, sat like statues. We didn't look at Sarah. We didn't look at each other. We stared at the glowing orb on the table. 30 seconds passed. The silence became deafening. Sarah looked at us, her eyes pleading for someone to jump in. She knew Gary had the solution to the legacy database issue. He'd literally built the database 15 years ago. Gary stared at his folded hands. He was following the rules. He was holding space. Finally, Elena looked up, sensing the pressure. Oh, yeah, the migration. I think we need to look at the encryption headers. That was the second woman. The threshold was met. Sarah looked at Gary. Gary, you know the legacy system better than anyone. What's the bottleneck? Gary looked at his watch. He waited exactly 5 seconds, the non-interruption buffer. Then he cleared his throat. I value the perspective you brought to this architecture, Sarah, Gary said, his voice as mechanical and devoid of emotion as a text-to-speech program, and I want to hold space for its potential. However, from my limited vantage, I have a concern regarding the legacy indexing. He stopped. He had used the validation acknowledgement. He had followed the buffer. He had spoken for exactly 12 seconds. And Sarah prompted, "What's the concern?" Gary looked at the digital equity timer. I have provided the substantive technical context. To elaborate further at this stage would be to occupy a disproportionate amount of the linguistic space. I will wait for further female-led conceptualizing before I contribute more of my allotted time. Sloan's pen moved furiously across her journal. She looked delighted. She actually smiled, a thin, triumphant expression that didn't reach her eyes. Sarah, however, looked like she was about to have an aneurysm. Gary, this isn't a debate about linguistic space. It's a technical hurdle. We have a deployment on Friday. I acknowledge the urgency of the deployment, Gary replied, his face a mask of calm indifference. But I must prioritize the safety of our collaborative environment. I am currently processing my urge to dominate this technical subsector. The meeting, which usually took 20 minutes, dragged on for 2 hours. It was a masterpiece of inefficiency. Every time a man spoke, he followed the 5-second buffer. Every time he disagreed, he recited the validation acknowledgement preamble like a liturgical chant. By the time the meeting ended, nothing had been decided. The migration script was still broken, and the digital equity timer showed that the men had only used 14% of the total speaking time. Sloan stood up. This was a breakthrough session, she declared. I saw a remarkable level of restraint. The gray sanctuary is finally beginning to breathe. Sarah and Elena didn't look like they were breathing. They looked like they were drowning. They were being forced to carry the entire weight of the company's intellectual output. while we, the men, stood by and watched them struggle, bound by the very rope Sloan had handed us. The email tone audit was the next phase of Sloan's campaign. She began BCCing herself on internal threads, looking for assertive imperatives. Mark, one of our junior devs, sent an email to Elena. Elena, I need the API documentation by end of day so I can finish the load balancer. Sloan flagged it within 10 minutes. She called Mark into her office, a space she had decorated with soft textures and non-hierarchical seating. Mark, she said, gesturing for him to sit on a beanbag chair that looked like a giant, defeated marshmallow. Your email to Elena was a textbook example of task-based erasure. You treated her as a function of your needs rather than a human being with her own creative agency. I need is a power claim. In the future, you will use collaborative inquiry. Mark didn't argue. He had seen what happened to Gary. He just nodded. I value the perspective you brought to my communication style, Sloan. I will calibrate accordingly. The result was the bland-bot era of communication. The men stopped using the words need, must, important, or urgent. We stopped using names. We stopped using greetings. The next email Mark sent looked like this. Subject: regarding the documentation, I am inquiring into the current status of the documentation. I want to hold space for the labor involved in its creation. If the documentation is available, it would be a valued addition to the repository. No pressure is intended on the creative timeline. It took Elena 20 minutes to figure out what he was actually asking for. When she walked over to his desk to clarify, Mark looked at his watch, waited 5 seconds, and said, I value the inquiry you brought to my cubicle, Elena. However, as Silas and Tom are currently visible in my peripheral vision, I am concerned that a 3-man cluster might create an imposing masculine frontier. I will respond to your inquiry via an equitable digital channel. Elena turned around and walked away. Her shoulders slumped. She wasn't an activist. She was a coder. She wanted to talk about Python libraries, not masculine frontiers. But Sloan was always there, lurking in the background with her journal, and no one wanted to be the next calibration target. The psychological effect on the men was profound, but not in the way Sloan intended. She expected us to be humbled. She expected us to be awakened. Instead, we just stopped caring. The emotional connection to the company, the pride we took in our uptime, the we're all in this together feeling of a late-night push, was severed. Stratos Integration was no longer our firm. It was Sloan's laboratory. And if the laboratory burned down because the lab assistants weren't allowed to speak, well, we'd just update our resumes and move on. We began to spend our time in the quiet room, a corner of the break room where no women ever sat because the chairs were uncomfortable. We didn't talk. Talking was dangerous. We sat in a row, staring at our phones, eating our lunches in a silence that was so thick it felt like physical matter. If Sloan walked in, we would all stand up simultaneously and leave the room, giving her maximum spatial occupancy. She thought it was a sign of respect. She thought she had successfully trained us to recognize our entitlement to space. She didn't realize that we were actually practicing social ghosting. We had decided that if our presence was inherently problematic, we would make ourselves as non-existent as possible. We stopped coming to the Friday happy hours. We stopped participating in the Office Fantasy Football League. We stopped making jokes. The office, which used to be filled with a hum of human connection, became a cold, sterile processing plant. The women felt it the most. Sarah and Elena, who used to be one of the guys in the best sense, equal partners in the trenches, were now isolated. They were the only ones allowed to be human, which meant they had to do all the social heavy lifting. They had to start all the conversations. They had to provide all the energy. They were exhausted, and they were starting to resent Sloan more than we ever could. The breaking point for the system, the first real crack in the hull, happened on Thursday afternoon. The London hub error I had noticed on Tuesday hadn't been fixed, because I hadn't reported it, and because Gary was holding space instead of monitoring the logs. The leak had grown. It wasn't just a data leak anymore. It was a cascading synchronization failure. At 3:15 p.m., the entire London trading platform went dark. This was a code red. The CEO is on a private jet and he's going to be screaming when he lands territory. Sarah burst into the dev area. The London hub is down. Everything is out of sync. Silas, Gary, what the hell happened? I looked at my watch. I waited 5 seconds. I value the urgency you're bringing to this crisis, Sarah, I said, my voice steady and completely indifferent. And I want to hold space for the stress you're experiencing. I noticed an initial discrepancy on Tuesday morning. Sarah's eyes went wide. Tuesday? You saw this Tuesday and you didn't say anything? I looked at Sloan, who had appeared at the edge of the cubicle farm, her journal open. According to Protocol 3, I said, gesturing toward Sloan, any technical disagreement or unsolicited intervention must be carefully processed to avoid intellectual gatekeeping. As you and Elena were the designated leads for the London migration, I recognized that my intervention would be an interruption of your creative agency. I decided to listen and allow the female-led process to reach its natural conclusion. Its natural conclusion is a total system blackout. Sarah screamed. Sloan stepped forward. Sarah, your tone is becoming reactive. Marcus is simply demonstrating the deference the protocol requires. He is respecting your leadership. Sarah turned on Sloan. Respecting my leadership? He's watching the company burn down because you told him he's not allowed to speak. We're losing $4 million an hour. Sloan, does your equity journal have a section for bankruptcy? Sloan didn't flinch. The financial cost is secondary to the cultural realignment. We are building a new Stratos. There won't be a Stratos by Monday. Sarah yelled. She turned back to me. Silas, please. Just fix it. Forget the rules. Just fix the damn hub. I looked at the digital equity timer, sitting on a nearby desk. It was red. I would love to assist Sarah, I said, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms. But I've already used 48% of my allotted speaking time for the day during the morning sync. If I help you now, I would be violating the linguistic quota. I wouldn't want to occupy space that belongs to you or Elena. I looked at Gary. He was already packing his bag. It was 3:30 p.m. I'm heading out, Gary said, not looking at anyone. I've processed my impulses for the day. I'll see you all tomorrow, provided the office is still open. Gary walked out. The most senior architect in the company, the only man who could truly fix a London hub in under an hour, just walked away. He didn't care. And as I looked at the red error logs on my screen, I realized that I didn't care either. Sloan wanted a world where men didn't run things. She was about to find out exactly what that looked like when the men decided to agree with her. BY Friday morning, Stratos Integration was no longer a fintech firm. It was a tomb of dead data and perfectly observed social etiquette. The London hub failure was still cascading, a digital wildfire that was currently jumping across the Atlantic to our East Coast nodes. In any other company, this would have been a war room situation. The lights would have stayed on all night. The air would have been thick with the smell of scorched coffee and adrenaline, and the sound of voices, loud, urgent, and overlapping, would have been a heartbeat of the recovery effort. Instead, there was only the rhythmic, mechanical clicking of keyboards and the soft, maddening pulse of the digital equity timers. The men had entered a state of technological zen. We had realized that the most powerful thing you can do to a person who wants to be your judge is to become a ghost. We didn't complain to HR. We didn't talk in the parking lot. We didn't even exchange knowing glances anymore. To look at another man with shared sense of irony was, according to Sloan's Week 2 memo, the construction of a subtextual masculine alliance. So we looked at nothing. We focused on our screens with the intensity of surgeons, doing exactly the work we were assigned, and absolutely nothing else. I watched Mark. He was 24, a kid who used to be so eager to please he'd practically vibrate when a senior dev looked at his code. Now, he sat with a posture that was eerily still. He was working on a small, non-critical documentation task. In his peripheral vision, he could see a database connection failing on Elena's screen. He could have fixed it with 4 keystrokes. He didn't even flinch. He was holding space for Elena to discover her own technical solution. He was being a perfect ally. Sloan was no longer the poised, asymmetrical architect of culture. She was beginning to look like a woman who had tried to cast a spell and accidentally summoned a void. She spent her morning pacing the floor, her heels sounding like gunfire in the silence. She would stop behind Gary's desk, the man who knew where all the bodies were buried in the codebase, and wait. Gary didn't acknowledge her. He was in a deep listening phase. "Gary," she said, her voice sounding thin and brittle. "The CEO, Mr. Sterling, is landing in 3 hours. He's seen the London reports. He's confused about the recovery timeline." Gary looked at his watch. He waited 5 seconds. "I value the perspective you brought to Mr. Sterling's anxiety, Sloan," Gary said. His voice was a flat, digital monotone, and I want to hold space for the gravity of the situation. However, as Sarah has the lead on the disaster recovery protocol, I am deferring to her conceptual framework. I wouldn't want to engage in emergency-based linguistic dominance. "Gary, the company is losing millions," Sloan hissed, leaning over his desk. "This isn't a workshop. I'm telling you to help her." Gary tilted his head, his expression a blank canvas of professional compliance. "I am currently processing the assertive imperative in your tone, Sloan. I want to ensure my response isn't a manifestation of my own unconscious need to gatekeep the solution. I will await a collaborative inquiry from Sarah once she has exhausted her female-led recovery options." Sloan's face went from pale to a mottled, angry red. She turned to me. "Silas, you get in the conference room. Now." I stood up. I didn't say a word. I followed her, ensuring I maintained a 3-foot deference buffer behind her. The conference room was a scene of total ideological carnage. Sarah and Elena were there, looking like they had aged a decade in 48 hours. The digital equity timer was glowing as steady, judging amber. "We are having a systemic integrity huddle," Sloan announced, though her voice was shaking. "We need to fix the London hub before Sterling walks through those doors. Sarah, give us the status." Sarah looked at me. There was no anger in her eyes anymore, just a profound, hollow exhaustion. She knew the game. She knew that I knew how to fix it. And she knew that Sloan's rules were the only thing keeping the lights off. "I can't find the sync lock," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "It's buried in the kernel," Gary wrote. "I've been through it 6 times. Every time I try to bypass it, the latency spikes. I don't know what to do." Sloan turned to me. "Silas, fix it. Now." That's a direct order. I looked at the digital equity timer. I waited. 1 woman had spoken, Sarah. 2, Sloan. The threshold was met. I waited through the 5-second buffer. "I value the directness of your order, Sloan," I said, "and I want to hold space for the authority you represent. However, to fix it would require me to override Sarah's current creative logic. According to Protocol 3, my role is to provide technical deference to the established female lead. If I intervene now, I am reinforcing the competence gap narrative you warned us about in the Monday orientation." "Silas, I'm suspending the protocol," Sloan shouted, slamming her hand on the table. I blinked slowly. "I value your desire for flexibility, Sloan, but the protocol stated that these were non-negotiable operating parameters. If I break them now, I am admitting that my masculine urgency is more important than the safety of the equitable environment. I have been training my brain to reject that kind of patriarchal shortcut. I am not yet comfortable with the intellectual colonization required to fix Sarah's work." "You're sabotaging me," Sloan shrieked. It wasn't a professional accusation. It was a primal scream. "You're all doing this. You're watching me fail so you can go back to your gray sanctuary. You're weaponizing your own incompetence." "It isn't incompetence, Sloan," I said, and for the first time I allowed a tiny microscopic sliver of a smile to touch the corner of my mouth. "It's compliance. We are being exactly what you told us to be. We are stepping back. We are listening. We are yielding space. We are letting you and Sarah and Elena lead. This is the world you described as the ideal vantage. If you don't like the view, perhaps the architecture was flawed from the start." Sloan looked like she was going to have a stroke. She turned to Elena. "Elena, tell him he's being a misogynist." Elena looked at Sloan. Then she looked at the digital equity timer. Then she looked at the blank, terrifying abyss of her own career if the London hub stayed dark. "No, Sloan," Elena said, her voice surprisingly steady. He's not being a misogynist. He's being a developer. And he's doing exactly what developers do when they're given a set of illogical constraints. He's following them to the point of system failure. You didn't build a culture. You built a deadlock. The next hour was a masterpiece of desperate, failed leadership. Sloan tried to micromanage Sarah through the code, a woman who couldn't read a line of Python, try and direct a senior dev on how to manage a Fintech kernel. The men stayed in the room. As ordered, we sat in a row, our hands folded, our eyes neutral. Every time Sloan asked us a question, we waited for the women to speak first. We waited for the buffer, and we used the validation acknowledgement. The communication was so slow, it was practically backwards. Tom, is the server responding? 5 seconds pass. I value the inquiry, Sloan. To provide a definitive yes or no would be to occupy a disproportionate amount of the linguistic space. I will wait for Elena's interpretation of the pings. By 1 p.m., Sloan was no longer a principal culture architect. She was a broken woman in an expensive linen suit, sitting on a beanbag chair in the corner of the room, sobbing quietly. She had realized that she had no power over us. You can only control people who care about the outcome. And we had stopped caring about the outcome the moment she told us our caring was a form of oppression. Then the elevator pinged. Mr. Sterling walked in. He was a man of the old world. All gray hair, sharp eyes, and a total lack of interest in thought space. He walked into the conference room and stopped. He saw the red timers. He saw the slogans on the walls. He saw his lead architect sitting in total silence. He saw his lead dev crying. And he saw Sloan, the woman he had paid 6 figures to optimize his firm, huddled on a beanbag. What? Sterling said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. The hell is going on in my office? Sloan scrambled to her feet, trying to wipe her eyes and adjust her glasses. Mr. Sterling, we are in the middle of a systemic recalibration. We've had a minor technical hurdle in London, but we are processing it through a new equitable framework. Sterling walked past her as if she were made of air. He walked straight to Gary. Gary, why is London dark? Gary looked at his watch. He looked at Sloan. He looked at the digital equity timer. I value the urgency you brought to this space, Mr. Sterling, Gary said, and I want to hold space for your concern. However, as a woman hasn't spoken in the last 5 minutes, I must remain in listening mode to ensure I am not. Gary, Sterling interrupted, if you say one more word of that gibberish, I'm going to fire everyone in this room, starting with the woman in the linen suit. Fix the damn hub. Gary looked at Sloan. He waited 5 seconds. Sloan, Gary said, do I have permission to dominate the technical subsector to address Mr. Sterling's masculine urgency? Sloan didn't even look up. She just nodded, a single, defeated motion. Gary turned to me. Silas, bypass the sync lock. Mark, reset the encryption headers. Tom, load the backup logs. Let's go. The men didn't cheer. We didn't high-five. We simply moved. In 20 minutes, the London hub was green. In 30, the East Coast was sinking. The gray sanctuary had returned, but it was different. The silence was gone, replaced by the hum of competent men doing their jobs. Sterling watched us work for a few minutes. Then he turned his gaze to Sloan. My office, he said. Now. The final batch would detail the aftermath, the ultimate irony of Sloan's departure, and the lesson the men took away from the ruins of the equity protocol. The setting, Monday morning at Stratos Integration, 2 weeks after the London Hub incident. The office didn't return to normal overnight. You don't just scrub 3 weeks of systemic psychological warfare off the walls with a bit of Windex and a fresh pot of coffee. But the silence was different now. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of vacuum. It was a quiet, industrious hum of a workshop that had just fired its most incompetent foreman. Sloan was gone. The official HR memo, sent out at 8 a.m., was a masterpiece of corporate euphemism. It stated that Sloan had decided to transition toward an independent consultancy role where she could focus on higher-level cultural theoreticals. Translation: Sterling had told her that if she ever stepped foot on a floor with a server rack again, he would have her escorted out by security teams who didn't care about linguistic thought space. I sat at my desk, watching Tom and Mark take down the identity alignment banners. They were doing it with a level of care that bordered on the ceremonial. The posters of male space occupancy were the first to go. Tom rolled them up and placed them in a recycling bin with a quiet, satisfied thud. The digital equity timers had already been vanished. I heard a rumor that Sterling had personally swept them off the table and into a cardboard box during his meeting with Sloan. I looked at my desk. My dual monitor setup was back in its original position. The technological barrier was back up, and I had never felt more connected to my work. I opened my terminal. The code was messy. 3 weeks of female-led conceptualizing without masculine technical gatekeeping had resulted in a codebase that looked like it had been written by someone trying to explain a poem using only emojis. It was buggy. It was inefficient. It was a disaster. But for the first time in a month, I felt the urge to fix it, not because I wanted to dominate the subsector, but because a broken system is an insult to people who live inside it. At 11 a.m., the normalization sync was called. This was the meeting that would define the post-Sloan era. We gathered in the conference room. The atmosphere was still tentative. The men sat on one side, the women on the other, a residual habit from the linguistic quota days. Sterling stood at the front. He wasn't wearing asymmetrical linen. He was wearing a shirt that had clearly been ironed by someone who didn't have time for metaphors. "All right," Sterling said, leaning his heavy palms on the table. "The experiment is over. We've lost 3 weeks of productivity for clients and about $12 million in projected revenue. We are currently the laughingstock of the London Fintech circle." He looked around the room, his gaze lingering on the men. "I've read the equity journals. I've seen the tone audits. I've looked at the Slack logs where you guys communicated like you were under interrogation by a hostile power." He paused, sighing. "I'm not interested in who started what. I'm interested in whether or not this company is going to survive the week. Sarah, you're the lead dev. Give me the truth. No jargon. No vantage. Just the code." Sarah looked at the men. She looked at Gary, then at me. She looked like she had finally woken up from a nightmare, only to find that her house had been robbed. "The truth," Sarah said, her voice finally losing that high-pitched strain of exhaustion. "The truth is that the code is a mess. We spent more time worrying about who was allowed to say if then statements than we did actually writing them. We're out of sync, we're behind schedule, and I'm about 20 minutes away from a total burnout." She turned to Gary. "Gary, I'm sorry. I should have told Sloan to shove her buffer on day one. I knew the legacy database was going to fail. I knew it on Tuesday. But I was so tired of being told that my success depended on your silence that I actually started to believe it." Gary looked at his watch. He waited exactly 1 second, just to be a prick. Then he smiled. A real, toothy, gray sanctuary smile. "I value the apology, Sarah," Gary said, his voice returning to its natural, gravelly warmth. "And I want to hold space for the fact that you're a damn good dev who got caught in a trap set by someone who doesn't know the difference between a logic gate and a garden gate. Now, you want to talk about linguistic space, or do you want to show you how to fix that sync lock?" Sarah laughed. It was the first time I'd heard laughter in that room in weeks. "Fix the damn lock, Gary," she said. The true victory, however, wasn't just a return to work. It was a fundamental shift in the power dynamic. Sloan had wanted to teach us a lesson about privilege and entitlement. She wanted us to realize how much space we took up, and we did. We realized that we took up exactly as much space as the firm needed to function. We realized that our interruptions were often just the sound of the system being kept on the rails. We realized that mansplaining was, in our context, usually just called training the juniors. But more importantly, we learned the power of not caring. A few days after Sloan left, Elena came over to my desk. She was struggling with a load balancer configuration. Under the protocol, I would have waited for a written inquiry and a 5-second buffer. I looked at her screen. I saw the error in 3 seconds. "The port isn't mapped, Elena," I said, pointing at the line. Elena started to say something, then stopped. She looked at me, a flicker of the old Sloan-era hesitation in her eyes. "Wait, was that a microaggression?" Should you have waited for me to finish my conceptual journey? I didn't look up from my own screen. I don't know, Elena. Does the port need to be mapped or not? It does, she said. Then map it. I replied, or don't. I don't care. I'm just telling you why it's broken. That was the new vibe. We weren't allies. We weren't mentors. We were colleagues who had been inoculated against the virus of office sensitivity. We had seen the void. We had seen what happens when the men stop caring about the culture, the feelings, and the vibe, and focus entirely on the output. And the result was that the women had to step up and realize that the patriarchy they were fighting was actually the very infrastructure that supported their own careers. The final irony came 2 months later. I was scrolling through a popular industry news site during lunch. There was a headline, Sloan v. Why the Great Quiet is the Next Frontier of Feminist Resistance. I clicked on it. It was an article written by Sloan. In it, she described her time at Stratos Integration, without naming U.S., though it was obvious. She framed the total collapse of the firm's productivity and the eventual failure of the Solaris campaign as a strategic success. She argued that by forcing the men into absolute silence, she had exposed the fragility of the masculine ego. She claimed that the men's withdrawal wasn't a failure of her rules, but a desperate, silent protest against the loss of unearned linguistic dominance. She even mentioned the equity journals, claiming they were trophies of self-reflection that the men would carry with them forever. I looked at my drawer. My equity journal was currently being used to level out a wobbly leg on my desk. Mark was using it to doodle caricatures of Sterling during long meetings. Gary had used the pages of his to start a small charcoal grill in the parking lot during our post-London hub Victory Barbecue. Sloan was still living in her story. She was still the hero. She was still the creative catalyst. She would go to the next firm, and she would try the same thing. She would find a new group of men, and she would tell them they were imposing frontiers. And maybe those men would fight her. Maybe they would get angry and go to HR and prove her right. But I really, truly hoped that they would do what we did. I hoped they would just stop caring. Stratos Integration is back to being a sanctuary of high-level boredom. The carpet is still gray. The lights still hum. But the communication is different now. It's louder. It's messier. Men and women argue. We interrupt each other. We gatekeep the code because the code is the only thing that matters. We realize that the equity protocol wasn't a tool for justice. It was a cage for competence. And once you realize that you have the key to the cage, and that the key is simply refusing to play the game, the warden becomes irrelevant. I still keep a copy of the Linguistic Quota. Memo pinned to the wall in the break room, right next to the coffee pot. Someone, I think it was Tom, added a handwritten note at the bottom in a bold, assertive marker. It reads, in the event of a system failure, please ignore all protocols and talk to the person who knows how to fix it. It's the only rule we have left. And so far, our uptime is 100%. The final lesson of the arrival wasn't about gender at all. It was about the nature of work. A company is a machine made of people. If you tell half of those people that their natural rhythm is a form of sabotage, eventually they will stop drumming. And when the drumming stops, you realize that the music wasn't just noise. It was the only thing keeping the machine from shaking itself to pieces. Sloan wanted a new vantage. She got one. She got to see exactly what a world looks like when men stop caring if she succeeds. And from what I can tell from her LinkedIn, she's still trying to figure out why the view from the top of the equity ladder was so incredibly lonely. As for me, I'm busy. I've got a new architect joining the team on Monday. I hear she's a genius with database sharding. I can't wait to interrupt her during our first huddle to tell her she's wrong about the index. And I can't wait for her to tell me to shut up and look at the data. It's going to be a great week.